This is Eli, and he's volunteered to be our wider ribcage model, and I'm going to be the narrow ribcage model. Eli by no means has the widest ribcage that I've ever seen, and I don't have the narrowest ribcage I've ever seen. So what we're going to explore here could be to a greater or lesser extent, depending on that factor. The first thing I want to look at is the width of Eli's ribcage in comparison to the width of my ribcage.
This diagram visually demonstrates that, and if we now superimpose onto this image a pair of scapula for both the wide and narrow rib cages, we can see something quite interesting. The scapula on the wide rib cage are going to sit further apart in comparison to those on the narrow rib cage.
And then what you will see here on his collarbones is if I place my hands in the line of his collarbones, you'll see that I'm sitting fairly horizontally. So we're going to get the tip of the shoulder, or the acromion process, out here on the side. If we look at my collarbones, they are sitting, and I put my hand onto them, in a slightly more diagonal fashion, meaning that my acromion process is much further forwards.
Once again, if we now superimpose a pair of torsos over this diagram, we can see a real-life example of the variances between the clavicle angles. On the wider rib cage, the clavicle is almost directly horizontal, whereas on the narrower rib cage, there is a diagonally upwards angle from the sternum, or center of the chest, to the shoulder tip, or acromion process. If we were to name the lateral raise exercise after its biomechanical pattern, then we would call it shoulder abduction. The primary muscles that abduct the shoulder are the supraspinatus, shown here by the pink circle on the rear of the shoulder, that initiates the first 15 to 30 degrees of the movement, and the medial or middle of the three deltoids, labeled as such. When hypertrophy is the goal, we want to isolate the stimulus provided by the movement to the primary mover, in this case, the middle delt. When you have identified which muscle you want to be the target, it is helpful to then consider where it attaches at both ends, better known as the origin and the insertion. I like to think of this as the hinge or door hardware, and it is this that we are visualizing shortening and lengthening to make the movement. Because the origin of the deltoid is located at the acromion process, marked with a green cross, this means the width of someone's ribcage is going to dictate their scapular plane. The other end of the deltoid attaches to the deltoid process, as shown here on our earlier image, marked with a yellow cross. The scapular plane is the functional movement plane aligned with the scapula's natural resting position on the rib cage, and it is going to allow for the most effective loading of the middle delt fibers, which have a vertical direction, and the safest loading of the shoulder joint. The scapular plane is going to be dictated by where the acromion process sits, which in turn is dictated by the width of the rib cage and the angle of the clavicle, as shown here on Eli and myself. We can therefore eliminate the middle of this equation and deduce that the width of the rib cage is going to determine the optimum position or movement plane for the arms in a lateral raise.
So if Eli takes a seat onto the box and faces towards the red stack of shelves there, and lifts his arm out to the side, which is the job of the medial delt, we can see that the deltoid is active here because he's in line with it. He has loaded the fibers, and the load is going to be here in line with those fibers.
In conclusion, the width of Eli's ribcage is going to mean that his scapular plane is going to sit closer towards the frontal plane, or, more true to the name of the exercise, laterally. Whereby for me, on the right of this video comparison, my scapular plane is going to be much further forward of my arms towards the sagittal plane. In both cases, Eli and my scapulars are able to glide smoothly across our rib cages, meaning that the shoulder joint is going to be stable and kept happy, whilst we are also getting the most out of loading the mid-delt for those aesthetically pleasing shoulder caps.